It was an accident so stupid, it was like running with a pencil. It was not a risk he was taking.
Steve Irwin was more than a fearless wildlife adventurer. He was a living legend, the man who brought the wild into our homes and hearts.
What I'll miss the most, and it's very selfish, he was fun. Steve was fun.
Millions watched him wrestle crocodiles, charm snakes, and inspire generations, believing nothing could ever touch his unstoppable spirit. Then, in September 2006, the unthinkable happened. Steve was gone, lost in a tragic freak accident that stunned the world. But the shocks didn't stop there. In the years that followed, his cherished legacy faced threats from billion-dollar mining interests, and the world finally heard from Terri Irwin, his grieving widow, who revealed truths about love, loss, and courage that left everyone speechless. This is the story you've never heard before. A love story that changed everything. It's almost impossible to talk about Steve Irwin without talking about Terri. Their love story wasn't just about two people finding each other. It was the heartbeat behind everything they built, from Australia Zoo to global conservation projects. And it all started in the most unlikely way, thousands of miles from the crocodiles and kangaroos Steve grew up with. Back in the early 1990s, Terri Irwin was living in Oregon, surrounded by towering evergreens and the cool, damp air of the Pacific Northwest. She wasn't just a casual animal lover. Terri ran Cougar Country Wildlife Park, a sanctuary she had poured her heart into, where she cared for injured eagles, bears, and cougars. Her life was dedicated to healing animals, often staying up nights nursing them back to health, then releasing them into the wild. For Terri, wildlife wasn't a hobby. It was her mission. On the other side of the world, Steve Irwin was already something of a legend in Queensland. The son of Bob and Lynn Irwin, he had grown up at their tiny reptile park, learning to catch crocodiles almost before he could walk. By his early 20s, he was leading daring crocodile relocations for Australia's wildlife authorities, grabbing these massive prehistoric reptiles with his bare hands to save both the animals and the people living nearby. He wasn't doing it for money or fame. He was doing it because he genuinely loved them. Fate brought Terri and Steve together in 1991 when Terri visited Australia as part of a trip to see wildlife facilities. She ended up at the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park, where Steve was in the middle of a crocodile demonstration. Picture this: khaki shorts, sweat dripping, and that famous, electrifying grin. He spoke about crocodiles like they were his best mates, describing their personalities, their intelligence, their quirks. While most people saw danger, Steve saw beauty. Terri was hooked, not just by his charisma, but by the way he talked about animals with pure, unfiltered passion. Steve would later admit that for him, it was love at first sight. Their connection was immediate, like two magnets snapping together. Only 4 months later, Steve proposed, and she said yes. From that moment, their lives became an adventure. Even their wedding wasn't ordinary. While most couples planned centerpieces and flowers, Steve and Terri were also planning television. Between cake tastings and vows, they sketched out the very first episode of what would become The Crocodile Hunter. And their honeymoon? Forget beaches and champagne. Steve whisked Terri off to far North Queensland, where they spent their honeymoon wrestling and relocating crocodiles. With a cameraman in tow, the footage they captured became the pilot episode of their now iconic series. Instead of lounging in luxury, they were knee-deep in swamps, dodging teeth, and laughing the whole way through. By 1996, their lives had shifted completely. They returned to the little 2-acre reptile park Bob and Lynn Irwin had started back in 1970. But with Steve's vision and Terri's dedication, it exploded into what we now know as Australia Zoo, a sprawling 40-hectare sanctuary filled with creatures from all over the globe. It wasn't just a zoo, It was their shared dream, a place where conservation and education went hand in hand, always with Steve's mantra, "The animals come first." Their fame skyrocketed. The Crocodile Hunter became a global hit, broadcast in more than 100 countries. Kids everywhere were yelling, "Crikey!" and parents were learning about wildlife through Steve's fearless, hands-on approach. But behind the cameras, Steve and Terri lived modestly. They weren't buying mansions or sports cars. Every cent went back into conservation. Through their charity, Wildlife Warriors, they funded anti-poaching patrols in Africa, built koala hospitals in Australia, and supported research projects across the globe. Steve once joked that his only luxury was massive debt because he kept pouring money into buying land to save habitat for animals. Terri stood right beside him, making every crazy idea possible. Together, they raised 2 children, Bindi and Robert, right in the middle of this whirlwind. Their family life was unconventional, sure, but it was full of love. Bindi and Robert grew up bottle-feeding kangaroos, cuddling koalas, and helping Mom and Dad with the animals. For Steve and Terri, parenting and conservation weren't separate. They were one and the same. It all seemed unstoppable. Love, family, animals, and a mission bigger than themselves. But then came the day that changed everything. The day the world stood still. Some moments in life carved themselves into history, not just for a family, but for the entire world. For millions, September 4th, 2006, is one of those days. For Terri Irwin, the morning started like so many others. At their family home near the zoo, she was juggling the ordinary chaos of motherhood. Robert, still just a toddler with his big brown eyes, had woken up with a little chest cold, and Terri stayed close to him, fussing the way only a mother can. Bindi, their bright-eyed daughter, was already awake, full of questions about everything around her. At 4:30 in the morning, Steve leaned down to kiss Terri goodbye. He was heading out for another adventure, filming a documentary called Ocean's Deadliest off the coast of the Great Barrier Reef. His hair was still damp from the early shower, his khaki shirt already smudged at the collar, but his grin was as wide as ever. Terri, with sleep still clinging to her eyes and her hair sticking out in 100 directions, gave him her usual playful warning. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." Steve's response? That big booming laugh that always seemed to fill the room. He pulled her close, kissed her forehead, and said, "Possum, that's everything." It was the last time she would ever see him. Hours later, the phone rang. Terri picked it up, expecting maybe a call from a crew member or perhaps Steve himself. Instead, she was met with words that shattered her entire world. Steve had been struck in the chest by a stingray barb. A freak accident, something so impossible it felt unreal. And just like that, the man who seemed invincible, who had danced with crocodiles, stared down deadly snakes, and leapt into situations no one else would dare, was gone. The news didn't just break Terri's heart, it broke the world's. Television networks interrupted regular programming, newspapers splashed his face across their front pages, and millions of fans wept for a man who had made them feel brave and alive. When the memorial service was held, Australia Zoo's Crocodiles, the very arena Steve had built with his own hands and passion, was packed with over 5,000 people. Another 300,000 stood outside the gates, many clutching single sunflowers, Steve's favorite flower, in a quiet show of respect. Around the globe, an estimated 300 million people tuned in to watch the farewell. And then came the moment that still gives people chills. Terri, dressed simply in black, walked onto the stage without a single note in her hand. She spoke straight from her heart, her voice steady even as grief threatened to consume her. She told the crowd about Steve's last voicemail, a message full of his usual warmth, ending with words of love for her and their kids. Her voice cracked only once, and in that crack, the world could hear the depth of her loss. But then, she did something remarkable. She straightened her shoulders, looked out over the sea of faces, and made a vow that Steve's dream, his kingdom of conservation and wildlife protection, would not die with him. She would carry the torch, not just for her children, but for the entire world that loved him. What she didn't say, what she couldn't have known in that moment of raw grief, was that keeping that promise wouldn't be easy. Behind the tears and tributes, there were already powerful forces circling. Corporations, lawyers, and opportunists saw Steve's death not as a tragedy, but as an opening. They wanted a piece of his legacy, and they were ready to fight for it. But before the legal battles began, before the dust settled, there was one question the world couldn't stop asking. Would Terri Irwin ever find love again? Irwin's wife breaks silence about her love life after Irwin's death. After Steve's death, the world grieved with Terri, but as the weeks turned into months and the months rolled into years, the public's gaze didn't soften. If anything, it grew harsher, sharper, and unbearably intrusive. Everywhere she went, one question seemed to follow her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Why hasn't she moved on? It was asked by reporters, whispered by strangers, and sometimes even voiced by friends who meant well but didn't understand. The world wanted a narrative of closure, of healing tied up neatly with a bow, but Terri Irwin's truth was nothing like that. When she finally broke her silence, more than 15 years after Steve's death, her answer was as steady, honest, and straightforward as Steve himself would have been. Terri wasn't waiting for another love story to begin, because for her, the story she had lived with Steve was already enough. While she missed him with a depth only she could carry, Terri wasn't living a life of isolation or emptiness. Her days were full, brimming with the responsibilities of running Australia Zoo, raising Bindi and Robert, and caring for the endless stream of orphaned or injured animals that arrived at her doorstep. Yet the nights told a different tale. In the quiet, when the work was done and the children were asleep, grief had a way of creeping back in. For a long time, she found comfort in the small, ordinary things that still carried his presence. One of Steve's old khaki shirts remained folded in her closet, and sometimes she would slip it over her shoulders. Though faded and softened from years of wear, it still carried the faintest trace of his scent, a ghostly comfort in a world that often felt too sharp without him. His toothbrush never left its place by the sink. Over time, the bristles stiffened and fused, turning it into something more than a household object. It became a quiet monument to a life interrupted too soon. Friends tried to help, offering gentle nudges toward companionship by introducing her to respectable widowers or single parents. They hoped to ease what they assumed must be her loneliness. Terri always accepted their kindness with grace, but never entertained the suggestions. She wasn't searching for a replacement because she had already experienced the kind of love that left no room for another. For her, that chapter had already been written, and no new beginning could compare. Instead, she surrounded herself with the parts of Steve she could still hold on to. On difficult nights, she sometimes rewatched old episodes of The Crocodile Hunter, letting his laughter and unfiltered excitement fill the room once more. There he was, brave, curious, full of life, with eyes that sparkled whenever he spoke about the animals he loved so fiercely. The sound of his voice was a balm, both comforting and heartbreaking, reminding her of everything they had shared and everything she had lost. Her children noticed these quiet rituals. Bindi, wise beyond her years, would sometimes find her mother staring at a photograph of Steve cradling a tiny fruit bat, eyes fixed as though she were trying to memorize every detail all over again. In those moments, no words were exchanged. Bindi would simply slip an arm around her mother's waist, standing with her in silence, the two of them bound by grief, but also by the unshakable strength Steve had instilled in them. Outside, the familiar chatter of lorikeets filled the air, a constant reminder that life in all its beauty still carried on. Of course, the public had its own version of the story. Gossip magazines speculated endlessly about her personal life, often linking her to friends or acquaintances. At one point, headlines tried to suggest she had found companionship with actor Russell Crowe, a family friend. Each story came and went, but the truth was much quieter and far less sensational. Terri's life was already full, with her children, her work, and the mission Steve had dedicated his life to. Still, grief has layers that few ever see. It wasn't a performance for cameras, nor was it a refusal to heal. It was simply her reality, a love so deep and all-consuming that it could never truly be replaced. For Terri, Steve wasn't just a husband, he was her partner in adventure, her co-creator of a life devoted to conservation, her great and enduring love. But just as she was learning to carry this private grief while navigating the public's gaze, another challenge was quietly looming in the background. It would come not from whispers of gossip or the flash of paparazzi cameras, but from something colder and far more unsettling. The battle for Steve's last sanctuary. By the end of 2007, the headlines about Steve Irwin's death had begun to fade. The world's attention had moved on. But just as Terri was starting to find her footing again, another storm was quietly gathering, one that threatened to destroy the very land Steve had poured his soul into protecting. It came in the form of a plain envelope, stamped with official markings, delivered not with sympathy, but with cold precision. Inside was a letter from a mining company called Cape Alumina. They weren't writing to offer condolences or support. They were writing to announce their plan, a massive bauxite mining project right on the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve in Cape York, Queensland. Now, to most people, that might sound like just another mining proposal. But to Terri, the words on that page felt like a knife. The reserve wasn't just land. It was 135,000 hectares of untouched wilderness, a living memorial created in Steve's honor after his death. This wasn't symbolic. It was sacred. Cape York is one of the last truly wild frontiers in Australia, a place where wetlands, savanna, and rainforest exist side by side. The Irwin Reserve alone contained 35 unique ecosystems, crystal-clear freshwater springs, and was a critical breeding ground for saltwater crocodiles, the very animals Steve had dedicated his life to understanding and protecting. The company's proposal spelled devastation in black and white. They wanted to strip mine 12,000 hectares, scraping away the topsoil, draining rivers, and bringing in convoys of ore trucks that would roar day and night. Imagine bulldozers where turtles once hatched, dust clouds choking the skies where rare palm cockatoos called, and rivers that had flowed for thousands of years diverted into mining pits. Terri sat with that letter in her hands, and the room seemed to spin. Steve had only been gone a year. The grief was still raw, and now the one wild sanctuary that carried his name was under threat. For Terri, it triggered something deep. She wasn't just Steve's widow, quietly mourning in the shadows. She was his partner in conservation, and she knew instantly what he would have done. With a fire in her chest, she pulled together a small team of lawyers, scientists, and supporters. This wasn't going to be a polite conversation. This was going to be war. From the beginning, the odds were stacked against her. Mining companies had money, lawyers, and powerful allies in government. Terri had none of that. What she did have was conviction, Steve's legacy, and the love of millions of people who had grown up watching him on television. And she was determined to use every ounce of it. She flew to Canberra with her boots still muddy from the reserve, refusing to play the polished lobbyist. She didn't walk into meetings with dry policy briefs. She stormed in carrying blown-up photographs of Steve wrangling crocodiles in the very rivers Cape Alumina wanted to drain. She showed pictures of delicate turtle hatchlings scrambling across the sand, images that made hardened politicians shift uncomfortably in their chairs. At the same time, Terri leaned on something she and Steve had always understood better than anyone else: the power of media. She live-streamed from the reserve, showing the world exactly what was at stake. Viewers saw the wetlands glistening under the sun, flocks of migratory birds filling the skies, and baby crocs sliding into the water. And then, in sharp contrast, they saw footage of heavy machinery parked at the edge, waiting to roll in. The message was clear. This wasn't just land. This was life. The public rallied. Children who had once watched the crocodile hunter sent in their pocket money to help save Steve's place. Thousands of small donations poured in, proof that even the youngest supporters understood the importance of keeping this wilderness intact. Still, the battle dragged on. In 2008, a court ruling handed Cape Alumina the right to conduct surveys on the land. It felt like a gut punch, but Terri refused to back down. Year after year, she fought, balancing legal battles with running Australia Zoo and raising her children. For 6 grueling years, she stood her ground, never letting go of the belief that Steve's sanctuary had to be protected. Finally, in 2013, after relentless campaigning and immense public pressure, the Queensland government made a historic decision. They passed legislation that permanently banned mining on the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve, giving it protections even stronger than those granted to the Great Barrier Reef. When the news broke, Terri stepped outside, away from the cameras. For the first time since Steve's memorial, she sobbed openly, not from grief, but from relief. The sanctuary was safe. Steve's dream had survived. What Terri wants the world to understand. By the time the world had shifted its focus to other things, Terri Irwin had already lived through enough heartbreak, enough battles, and enough victories to fill several lifetimes. Yet, even after years of carrying the weight of public expectation and private grief, she never lost sight of the lessons her journey had carved deep into her soul. If there are truths she wants people to take from her story, they are not complicated or wrapped up in polished speeches. They are raw, lived in, and shaped by the love of a man who changed her life forever and the fight to preserve the world he loved so much. The first truth Terri wants people to understand is that grief is not a task with a finish line. It does not vanish after a set period, nor does it obey the tidy stages people so often talk about. Grief is something you learn to live with, like a new language that becomes part of you. For Terri, it was never about forgetting Steve or moving on, as so many strangers suggested. Instead, it was about growing around the loss, finding ways to keep his presence woven into her everyday life. She kept reminders of him everywhere, not in a way that kept her stuck, but in a way that made the house feel alive with his memory. The sound of his voice on their old home voicemail greeting, echoing through the hall, was one of those anchors. To anyone else, it might seem like a small detail, but to her, hearing him say those familiar, upbeat words was a comfort, a reminder that his spirit hadn't gone anywhere. It was still stitched into the very walls of their home. The second truth is that love does not fade with death. It shifts, it transforms, but it never loses its strength. Terri often reflected on how her love story with Steve was not a chapter that closed. It was the whole book. Even years after his passing, she celebrated him not with solemn memorials, but with joyful remembrances. On what would have been his 60th birthday, she chose to share not a sad image, but a muddy, laughing snapshot of their time in the field together. For her, that photo wasn't just a memory. It was a declaration. Their partnership had been about adventure, passion, and living life in the thick of things. That bond was unshakable, and even in his absence, he remained the only person she could imagine standing beside in the messiest, muddiest parts of life. And then there is the third truth, the one that perhaps defines the legacy they built together. Terri has always believed that conservation is not about politics or numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about people, families, and the future we want for our children. When she fought to protect the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve from mining interests, she realized that arguing over jobs and statistics would never be enough. So, instead, she brought the issue back to where it mattered, the human heart. She invited families of miners to walk the land themselves, to breathe in the wild air, to see the crystal-clear springs and watch turtles hatch on untouched shores. Many of them had never even seen these landscapes, though their ancestors once depended on them. One father, hardened by years of labor in the mines, found himself in tears as he admitted his own children had never known such unspoiled beauty. That moment cut deeper than any legal argument ever could. Terri had shown, rather than told, that while a job might put food on the table for today, healthy rivers, thriving ecosystems, and protected lands could sustain countless tomorrows. These three truths, about grief, about love, and about the meaning of conservation, became Terri's compass in a life she never planned for but was determined to honor. They shaped her decisions, her resilience, and her fight to ensure Steve's vision did not fade with him. But even with these truths guiding her, the question remained, what does Steve's legacy look like today? And perhaps even more important, what role has Terri played in shaping it into something bigger than either of them ever imagined? Steve Irwin's living legacy. Step through the gates of Australia Zoo today, and it feels like stepping into a world brimming with life, energy, and the unmistakable heartbeat of Steve Irwin's vision. Everywhere you look, there he is, khaki sleeves rolled up, grin wide, eyes twinkling with that infectious curiosity, holding a baby wombat as if it were the most precious thing on earth. Small plaques beneath his images sum up a life lived with unshakable purpose. The man who taught us to care. But Steve's legacy is far more than pictures and plaques. It is alive, growing, and touching thousands of lives every single day. The Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve, once under threat from mining companies, has flourished under Terri's vigilant stewardship. Since the landmark 2013 victory that saved the reserve, another 80,000 hectares have been added, protecting rare wetlands, rainforest, and the breeding grounds of saltwater crocodiles. This is not just land on a map, it is a living sanctuary, a place where endangered turtles make their first journey to the sea, where bird calls echo through untouched forests, and where children can witness the untamed world that inspired Steve's boundless passion. Donations continue to arrive from every corner of the globe, many in small, heartfelt ways. Crayon-scrawled envelopes filled with pocket money from 6-year-old children. Notes lovingly marked for Steve's Crocs. Each contribution, no matter the size, is a testament to the ongoing love and admiration for the man who made conservation exciting. The Irwin family is the heartbeat of this legacy. Bindi, once the wide-eyed girl who grew up in front of cameras, has become a mother herself. Her daughter, Grace Warrior, now explores the zoo under the same watchful eyes that once guided Bindi, learning the names and habits of the Aldabra tortoises, participating in feeding routines, and even attending staff meetings, already absorbing the ethos of respect and stewardship that has defined the family for decades. Robert, who was just a toddler when his father passed, has forged his own path, combining artistry and purpose. His wildlife photography, which began as a curiosity at age 6, now captures breathtaking images that tell urgent stories about endangered species, habitat destruction, and the fragile beauty of life on Earth. His work carries Steve's sense of wonder, but is unmistakably his own. Terri remains the cornerstone of it all. She rises before 5 a.m., thermos of strong black tea in hand, walking through the zoo to check on every animal as if they were old friends. But she hasn't just preserved Steve's legacy, she has expanded it. Programs like the Khaki Crew bring teenagers struggling with depression and anxiety into the zoo to work alongside the keepers for 6 weeks, allowing them to reconnect with life, nature, and purpose. The results are profound, with significant drops in anxiety scores and lasting impacts on young lives. It is a philosophy Steve would have recognized instantly. Animals have a unique ability to heal the parts of us that people sometimes break. In 2018, the Queensland government recognized the extraordinary impact of Steve Irwin's life and declared November 15th as Steve Irwin Day, an annual tribute to his legacy, his conservation work, and the philosophy he lived by. Schools, wildlife centers, and communities across Australia and the globe now use the day to teach children the importance of caring for the natural world, inspiring a new generation to follow in the footsteps of the man who turned conservation into an adventure. Steve's legacy is also a story of resilience, family, and purpose. Terri, Bindi, and Robert have carried his vision into the modern world, ensuring that every rescued animal, every protected hectare of rainforest, and every young person inspired by the zoo is a living tribute. The empire they maintain isn't about wealth or fame, it's about stewardship, joy, and the continuation of a dream sparked decades ago by a man in khaki with boundless energy and an unshakable heart. Today, Australia Zoo isn't just a park. It's a heartbeat, a classroom, a sanctuary, and a home. It is proof that one person's passion, amplified by family and community, can ripple outwards to change the world. Steve Irwin's story didn't end on that tragic day in September 2006. It continues every day, in the crocs he saved, the forests he protected, the children he inspired, and the family who carries the flame forward with unbreakable love. What are your thoughts about what Terri Irwin has come up to say? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. While you're still here, check out the next video that pops up on your screen.